Chapter 5. The night grew stormy. The hollow winds swept over the mountains and blew bleak and cold around. The clouds were driven swiftly over the face of the moon, and the Duke and his people were frequently involved in total darkness. They had traveled on silently and dejectedly for some hours, and were bewildered in the wilds, when they suddenly heard the bell of a monastery chiming for midnight prayer. Their hearts revived at the sound, which they endeavored to follow, but they had not gone far when the gale wafted it away, and they were abandoned to the uncertain guide of their own conjectures. They had pursued for some time the way which they judged led to the monastery, when the note of the bell returned upon the wind, and discovered to them that they had mistaken their route. After much wandering and difficulty, they arrived, overcome with weariness, at the gates of a large and gloomy fabric. The bell had ceased, and all was still. By the moonlight, which through broken clouds now streamed upon the building, they became convinced it was the monastery they had sought, and the Duke himself struck loudly upon the gate. Several minutes elapsed. No person appeared, and he repeated the stroke. A step was presently heard within. The gate was unbarred, and a thin, shivering figure presented itself. The Duke solicited admission, but was refused, and reprimanded for disturbing the convent at the hour sacred to prayer. He then made known his rank, and bade the friar inform the superior that he requested shelter from the night. The friar, suspicious of deceit and apprehensive of robbers, refused with much firmness, and repeated that the convent was engaged in prayer. He had almost closed the gate, when the Duke, whom hunger and fatigue made desperate, rushed by him, and passed into the court. It was his intention to present himself to the superior, and he had not proceeded far when the sound of laughter, and of many voices in loud and mirthful jollity, attracted his steps. It led him through several passages to a door, through the crevices of which light appeared. He paused a moment, and heard within a wild uproar of merriment and song. He was struck with astonishment, and could scarcely credit his senses. He unclosed the door, and beheld in a large room, well lighted, a company of friars, dressed in the habit of their order, placed round a table which was profusely spread with wines and fruits. The superior, whose habit distinguished him from his associates, appeared at the head of the table. He was lifting a large goblet of wine to his lips, and was roaring out, "Profusion and confusion," at the moment when the Duke entered. His appearance caused a general alarm. That part of the company who were not too much intoxicated arose from their seats, and the superior, dropping the goblet from his hands, endeavored to assume a look of austerity which his rosy countenance belied. The Duke received a reprimand, delivered in the lisping accents of intoxication, and embellished with frequent interjections of hiccup. He made known his quality, his distress, and solicited a night's lodging for himself and his people. When the superior understood the distinction of his guest, his features relaxed into a smile of joyous welcome, and taking him by the hand, he placed him by his side. The table was quickly covered with luxurious provisions, and orders were given that the Duke's people should be admitted and taken care of. He was regaled with the variety of the finest wines, and at length, highly elevated by monastic hospitality, he retired to the apartment allotted him, leaving the superior in a condition which precluded all ceremony. He departed in the morning, very well pleased with the accommodating principles of monastic religion. He had been told that the enjoyment of the good things of this life was the surest sign of our gratitude to heaven, and it appeared that within the walls of a Sicilian monastery the precept and the practice were equally enforced. He was now at a loss what course to choose, for he had no clue to direct him towards the object of his pursuit, but hope still invigorated and urged him to perseverance. He was not many leagues from the coast, and it occurred to him that the fugitives might make towards it with the design of escaping into Italy. He therefore determined to travel towards the sea, and proceed along the shore. At the house where he stopped to dine, he learned that 2 persons, such as he described, had halted there about an hour before his arrival, and had set off again in much seeming haste. They had taken the road towards the coast, whence it was obvious to the Duke they designed to embark. He stayed not to finish the repast set before him, but instantly remounted to continue the pursuit. To the inquiries he made of persons he chanced to meet, favourable answers were returned for a time, but he was at length bewildered in uncertainty, and travelled for some hours in a direction which chance, rather than judgment, prompted him to take. The falling evening again confused his prospects, and unsettled his hopes. The shades were deepened by thick and heavy clouds that enveloped the horizon, and the deep-sounding air foretold a tempest. The thunder now rolled at a distance, and the accumulated clouds grew darker. The Duke and his people were on a wild and dreary heath, round which they looked in vain for shelter, the view being terminated on all sides by the same desolate scene. They rode, however, as hard as their horses would carry them, and at length one of the attendants spied on the skirts of the waste a large mansion, towards which they immediately directed their course. They were overtaken by the storm, and at the moment when they reached the building, a peal of thunder, which seemed to shake the pile, burst over their heads. They now found themselves in a large and ancient mansion, which seemed totally deserted, and was falling to decay. The edifice was distinguished by an air of magnificence, which ill accorded with the surrounding scenery, and which excited some degree of surprise in the mind of the Duke, who, however, fully justified the owner in forsaking a spot which presented to the eye only views of rude and desolated nature. The storm increased with much violence, and threatened to detain the Duke a prisoner in his present habitation for the night. The hall, of which he and his people had taken possession, exhibited in every feature marks of ruin and desolation. The marble pavement was in many places broken, the walls were mouldering in decay, and round the high and shattered windows the long grass waved to the lonely gale. Curiosity led him to explore the recesses of the mansion. He quitted the hall, and entered upon a passage which conducted him to a remote part of the edifice. He wandered through the wild and spacious apartments in gloomy meditation, and often paused in wonder at the remains of magnificence which he beheld. The mansion was irregular and vast, and he was bewildered in its intricacies. In endeavouring to find his way back, he only perplexed himself more, till at length he arrived at a door which he believed led into the hall he first quitted. On opening it, he discovered, by the faint light of the moon, a large place, which he scarcely knew whether to think a cloister, a chapel, or a hall. It retired in long perspective, in arches, and terminated in a large iron gate, through which appeared the open country. The lightning flashed thick and blew around, which, together with the thunder that seemed to rend the wide arch of heaven, and the melancholy aspect of the place, so awed the Duke that he involuntarily called to his people. His voice was answered only by the deep echoes which ran in murmurs through the place, and died away at a distance, and the moon, now sinking behind a cloud, left him in total darkness. He repeated the call more loudly, and at length heard the approach of footsteps. A few moments relieved him from his anxiety, for his people appeared. The storm was yet loud, and the heavy and sulphurous appearance of the atmosphere promised no speedy abatement of it. The Duke endeavoured to reconcile himself to pass the night in his present situation, and ordered a fire to be lighted in the place he was in. This, with much difficulty, was accomplished. He then threw himself down on the pavement before it, and tried to endure the abstinence which he had so ill observed in the monastery on the preceding night. But to his great joy, his attendants, more provident than himself, had not scrupled to accept a comfortable quantity of provisions which had been offered them at the monastery, and which they now drew forth from a wallet. They were spread upon the pavement, and the Duke, after refreshing himself, delivered up the remains to his people. Having ordered them to watch by turns at the gate, he wrapped his cloak round him, and resigned himself to repose. The night passed without any disturbance. The morning arose fresh and bright. The heavens exhibited a clear and unclouded concave. Even the wild heath, refreshed by the late rains, smiled around, and sent up with the morning gale a stream of fragrance. The Duke quitted the mansion, reanimated by the cheerfulness of morn, and pursued his journey. He could gain no intelligence of the fugitives. About noon he found himself in a beautiful, romantic country, and having reached the summit of some wild cliffs, he rested to view the picturesque imagery of the scene below. A shadowy, sequestered dell appeared buried deep among the rocks, and in the bottom was seen a lake, whose clear bosom reflected the impending cliffs, and the beautiful luxuriance of the overhanging shades. But his attention was quickly called from the beauties of inanimate nature to objects more interesting, for he observed two persons, whom he instantly recollected to be the same that he had formerly pursued over the plains. They were seated on the margin of the lake, under the shade of some high trees at the foot of the rocks, and seemed partaking of a repast which was spread upon the grass. 2 horses were grazing near. In the lady, the Duke saw the very air and shape of Julia, and his heart bounded at the sight. They were seated with their backs to the cliffs upon which the Duke stood, and he therefore surveyed them unobserved. They were now almost within his power, but the difficulty was how to descend the rocks, whose stupendous heights and craggy steeps seemed to render them impassable. He examined them with a scrutinizing eye, and at length espied, where the rock receded, a narrow, winding sort of path. He dismounted, and some of his attendants, doing the same, followed their lord down the cliffs, treading lightly, lest their steps should betray them. Immediately upon their reaching the bottom, they were perceived by the lady, who fled among the rocks, and was presently pursued by the Duke's people. The cavalier had no time to escape, but drew his sword, and defended himself against the furious assault of the Duke. The combat was sustained with much vigor and dexterity on both sides for some minutes, when the Duke received the point of his adversary's sword, and fell. The cavalier, endeavoring to escape, was seized by the Duke's people, who now appeared with the fair fugitive. But what was the disappointment, the rage of the Duke, when, in the person of the lady, he discovered a stranger! The astonishment was mutual, but the accompanying feelings were, in the different persons, of a very opposite nature. In the Duke, astonishment was heightened by vexation, and embittered by disappointment. In the lady, it was softened by the joy of unexpected deliverance. This lady was the younger daughter of a Sicilian nobleman, whose avarice, or necessities, had devoted her to a convent. To avoid the threatened fate, she fled with the lover to whom her affections had long been engaged, and whose only fault, even in the eye of her father, was inferiority of birth. They were now on their way to the coast, whence they designed to pass over to Italy, where the Church would confirm the bonds which their hearts had already formed. There the friends of the cavalier resided, and with them they expected to find a secure retreat. The Duke, who was not materially wounded, after the first transport of his rage had subsided, suffered them to depart. Relieved from their fears, they joyfully set forward, leaving their late pursuer to the anguish of defeat and fruitless endeavor. He was remounted on his horse, and having dispatched 2 of his people in search of a house where he might obtain some relief, he proceeded slowly on his return to the castle of Mazzini. It was not long ere he recollected a circumstance which, in the first tumult of his disappointment, had escaped him, but which so essentially affected the whole tenor of his hopes as to make him again irresolute how to proceed. He considered that, Although these were the fugitives he had pursued over the plains, they might not be the same who had been secreted in the cottage, and it was therefore possible that Julia might have been the person whom they had for some time followed from thence. This suggestion awakened his hopes, which were, however, quickly destroyed, for he remembered that the only persons who could have satisfied his doubts were now gone beyond the power of recall. To pursue Julia when no traces of her flight remained was absurd, and he was, therefore, compelled to return to the Marquis as ignorant and more hopeless than he had left him. With much pain he reached the village which his emissaries had discovered, when fortunately he obtained some medical assistance. Here he was obliged by indisposition to rest. The anguish of his mind equalled that of his body. Those impetuous passions which so strongly marked his nature were roused and exasperated to a degree that operated powerfully upon his constitution, and threatened him with the most alarming consequences. The effect of his wound was heightened by the agitation of his mind, and a fever, which quickly assumed a very serious aspect, cooperated to endanger his life.